Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. So I just recently read an article that was called 8 Things You Should Never Say to Your Partner. Let's talk about why this doesn't always work when it comes to a narcissistic relationship. I love reading relationship advice articles, mostly because I want to see whether or not they're of any use to people going through narcissistic relationships. This particular one was in the New York Times. The New York Times has something against narcissistic relationships. They seem to think that there's no such thing. So I try to keep pointing out the holes in it, and maybe someday they will be willing to acknowledge it. But here's an article like this. Interestingly, the advice was good. The therapist's insight throughout the article was good. However, there is something that gets missed when we don't account for relationships that are tinged by narcissism. Now, some of the advice was standard garden variety stuff like don't say things like you never and you always, like you're not supposed to do that. And while the article doesn't point it out, those kinds of statements, you never, you always, are kind of veering into gaslighting territory because it simply is not possible for something to never or always be true, short of you never sprout wings and fly to the grocery store and instantly teleport home the eggs I need for this recipe. Using terms like you never or you always leads to generalizations and misses the opportunity to stay focused on the issue at hand. The article also talks about drawing on an old improv trick that we've talked about on this channel. Don't ever say to your partner, yes, but rather stay yes and, because that keeps the conversation going, and then it doesn't deteriorate into sort of a contradiction. The next one they shared was pure narcissistic behavior. Now, it's not to say that people who do not have that kind of personality don't do this next thing. They can and they do. But the thing that they brought up was don't engage in comparison in your relationships. For example, John's wife actually takes the kids to school every day, or Mary's spouse always goes with them on business trips. Now, the article points out that the reason you're not supposed to say this is because it froths up jealousy. But it's actually part of the dynamic of triangulation. And this sidles up to the next piece of feedback, which is, this never came up in my other relationships, or this was never an issue in my other relationships. Something else you're never supposed to say. This is in the same vein. It's very triangulating. And triangulation is a common theme in narcissistic relationships and is something that keeps the narcissistic person in power, because the indoctrination of these relationships means that you are now not only trying to stay sane in a gaslighting and manipulative relationship, but that you are now also in competition with a variety of third parties. Okay, so the next one of these 8 things that you're not supposed to say in a relationship was definitely a gaslighty one. That is, that you're never supposed to say, you are overreacting. Again, in this article, they didn't call it out as gaslighting, but it is one of the most classical gaslighting phrases out there. You are overreacting is a pathologizing of a person's emotional state. You are reacting, the other person may react differently, but to tell someone that you are overreacting, plain and simple gaslighting 101. And I wish that in this article, they had called it what it was. The real problem is that the article then goes on to advise the person who says the words, you are overreacting, to instead say, okay, the person who says that is supposed to say instead, I am listening. Tell me what you are having a hard time with. And that's when I said, no, this is not cool. Because when folks in narcissistic relationships hopefully read these relationship advice articles and think, okay, yes, my partner tells me I'm overreacting all the time, no matter what reaction I have. I get it. I'm supposed to tell my partner that they are listening and to ask me what I'm having a hard time with. Is that going to work? Folks, I am far more likely to sprout those wings to go to the teleported grocery store than for any narcissistic person. Instead of them saying, you are overreacting, to teach them to say, I am listening, I am here, tell me what is on your mind. they are more likely to have their head do the spinny exorcist thing before they say that. And no, they won't learn it. And in that same vein, the article suggests that one of the 8 things that you're not supposed to say, calm down. It's true, you're not supposed to say calm down. But again, narcissistic folks will say that all the time. It's gaslighting. They didn't call it gaslighting, but if it happens repeatedly, it is. Finally, the article brings up, it's not that big of a deal. You're not supposed to say that. Well, again, that's gaslighting. The guidance in the article that they give, like the thing you're supposed to do, things like ask your partner what they need right now, the narcissistic person is never going to do that with you. And if you ask them that, then the reasonable guess is that they're going to say to you, I'll tell you what I need right now for you to shut your mouth and leave me alone. That's not exactly productive, is it? And the other things that this article was suggesting to say instead were things like, what do you need right now? Acknowledge that you have different perspectives. Ask your partner to help you understand why a given issue is important. Offer support. Say things like, help me understand what you are struggling with. Talk about your own needs, or try saying things like, what I'm hearing from you is ... And when I read that advice, I really winced because I imagined a well-intended person in a narcissistic relationship reading this article and trying these things. And I also imagined what would come back at them. It would be things like, shut your mouth, stop acting like a shrink, no, we don't have different perspectives, you are wrong and I am right. Why the hell should I explain this to you? If you can't figure it out, then there is no point in my explaining. And oof, if you were to try to talk about your needs, well, that's not a thing in this relationship and any of these relationships, and I don't recommend it. And when I read these articles, I do realize that there's a world of people out there in generally healthy relationships that need a tweak or a tune-up. That's not what a narcissistic relationship is. What is needed in these kinds of relationships is more of a how much can we get for the parts situation, not a tune-up. On behalf of everyone out there in narcissistic relationships, I'm kind of jealous when I learn that a simple turn of the phrase can turn the ship around. That is simply not the story for people in narcissistic relationships. And it can often magnify the shame, the self-blame, and the confusion people in these relationships face. You feel helpless because the advice isn't working. Most mainstream sources of information don't offer guidance that people in narcissistic relationships can safely or sensibly use in most situations. And when I hear these things, you are overreacting, the comparing someone to someone else, the never always things you're not supposed to saying, the gaslighting, this doesn't just happen in intimate relationships. It's the bread and butter of communication in narcissistic family systems, friendships, and workplaces. It's simply unhealthy, and not just in close relationships, but people in relationships that are narcissistic do not have much likelihood of turning these patterns around. The article was very useful in pointing out problematic patterns. The fix, however, the fixes they suggested are never going to happen for people in toxic or narcissistic relationships. I understand why that is in this article. This article was pitched toward the person who is trying to be better in their relationship, to not say these 8 things you're not supposed to say. And so, if a person who is trying to be better sometimes does one of these 8 things, and we all do, it's a wake-up call that these are not cool or not healthy things to say in a relationship. But alas, if the people who are reading this are in narcissistic relationships, they're having this happen to them all the time. So it runs the risk of not educating people that these phrases, especially when they occur alongside invalidation, low empathy, and entitlement, are a problem that do not have a solution. I completely agree. Those are definitely 8 things you shouldn't tell a partner. The problem is those 8 things are constantly coming at people in these relationships. And sometimes the guidance, well-intentioned as it is, might need a warning label. This article may not work if you are in a narcissistic relationship. Thanks again.